So if without any ado, I think let's begin the presentation.
All right. So without further ado, I'll start the presentation on the democratization of unrecognized states. So our introduction, the topic is the democratization of unrecognized states, and I chose this topic because I believe there's an empirical gap in knowledge regarding how the democratization of unrecognized states is carried out. What are the domestic dynamics that feed into that? Secondarily, as a conflict analysis and resolution researcher, I wanted to consider the impact of democratization of unrecognized states on conflict resolution, which would address a policymaking gap because policymakers are kind of trying to negotiate their international approaches, negotiations with domestic dynamics that are happening at the same time. And they're kind of doing this blind at this point. With regards to why I felt qualified to do this, I come from an unrecognized state, Northern Cyprus, and I was a part of a pro-peace, pro-democracy social movement over there, and I have a comparative political science background, so it allowed me to utilize my background and get some heuristic knowledge as to what factors or signs to look for with regards to how unrecognized states are democratizing or not, especially because it is hard to find information on unrecognized states online or from most other resources. This topic especially is of prominence at this point because democracy is in decline all over the world according to the Freedom House scores, a map of which you can see on the bottom left. And as increased ethno-nationalist movements are seen around the world, such as with Catalonia in Spain and with Kurdistan in northern Iraq. So regarding the importance of research, I think that I am helping further understand the domestic dynamics of unrecognized states. I am providing, hopefully, an increased understanding of modern democratization processes. And I am hoping to produce policy-relevant models for addressing conflicts where unrecognized states are involved. My problem statement is that the field has a significant need for increasing our scholarly understanding regarding the domestic affairs of unrecognized states in order to help better tailor our conflict resolution approaches and render them more effective in both the short and the long term. Therefore, with my literature review, my main topic that I reviewed the literature being was on unrecognized states. Unfortunately, the literature is scant and it's exploratory and based on anecdotal evidence. However, of course, these exploratory studies are the building blocks of the present study. They are very interesting, very insightful studies, and I made use of them plentifully. According to this literature, most scholars agree that unrecognized states cannot fully democratize. Most of them, when they do, they are exceptions. And there is just one scholar that I have known of who has claimed that non-recognition can actually help with democratization. Instead, most believe that greedy elites and sponsors who benefit from non-recognition in order to pursue their own monetary or national security gains tend to prolong the status quo and tend to undermine democracy, whereas local critical opposition may work to provide some democratical increase in democracy. The main scholars that I've looked at, there are three who have come up with hypotheses concerning the democratization of unrecognized states, first being Kasperson. According to Kasperson, the degree of siege mentality a unrecognized state is under, and the domestic contention, socio-psychological, between a need for unity and the need for plurality dictates how democratization takes place in unrecognized states. The second set of scholars were Kopacek et al., who believe that over a longer period of time, unrecognized states will lose their repressive capacity, which will open up space for critical opposition and critical civil society to help promote democratization, although this would be constrained by external actors mostly. Waller, in the meantime, has looked at how a crisis of legitimacy, especially due to the idea of earned sovereignty, which is the idea that if an unrecognized state democratizes, it can earn sovereignty, causes a crisis of legitimacy, where this crisis of legitimacy opens up space for dissent and makes the status quo vulnerable, which can lead to democratization over the long term. Now, there are some shortcomings to this literature, and I tried to find some solutions to that. Firstly, as I have underlined before, the literature is unempirical, it's single case based and anecdotal. So I took the hypotheses produced in such a fashion, and I tried to test it in a comparative scheme to add some empirical flavor to that. Secondly, there's no dialogue between the literature on democratization of unrecognized states and the literature on democratization at large. So I tried to melt these two literatures and try to come up with a more complex understanding of democratization and how it can be observed in unrecognized states. Thirdly, there is no problematization or discussion of alternatives to the policy of non-recognition, really. And I think this is because there's no real understanding of how non-recognition in action affects the democratization of unrecognized states. So I deconstructed the policy, looked at its different effects overall, and I hope that will give some further insights into the interplay between non-recognition and democratization of unrecognized states. So in order to map the two literatures on democratization of unrecognized states and democratization, I reviewed the literature on democratization as well, and I uncovered 5 general categories that might affect the democratization of unrecognized states. First of which is economic growth, with an emphasis on social inequalities and wealth accumulation and distribution. Another is political culture, with an emphasis on repertoires of contention and critical education and media. Then another one is mode of preceding dictatorship. Another one is a state's dependence on its citizens, the level of its dependence. And lastly, the threat of civil war, which all, according to the literature, should affect the democratization of unrecognized states. I uncovered 5 hypotheses to be tested based on these 2 veins of literature. First 3, Kasperson, Kopeček et al., and Waller, I just went over. Of course, I added a null hypothesis to see if there was any effect at all of non-recognition on democratization. And then a last one is based on the literature review on democratization at large, which is that economic opportunities or the modes of economic activities available should govern how democratization is carried out in unrecognized states. So the main problem vis-a-vis conflict resolution is that because we do not understand really why some unrecognized states democratize, whereas democracy building has implications on peace building efforts at tracks 1, 2, and 3, understanding the democratization of unrecognized states is a necessity to lead us to have more effective conflict resolution processes. The guiding theories I chose are 2. The first is dynamical systems theory. I am looking for a non-static image of dynamic interplay of multiple variables at multiple levels that should be affecting democratization because it's a dynamic social phenomenon in my conceptualization. I have an emphasis on negative and positive feedback loops and their relative strength. I have considered attractor states, and maybe that concept explains why sometimes unrecognized states can remain authoritarian or democratic for a long period of time. And then I have also looked at the concept of conflict traps, where I consider non-recognition to be a conflict trap in the sense that non-recognition actually produces some further conflict over the longer term. I've also looked at path dependence. I think this theory explains why attractive states can occur because historical antecedents can really have a disproportionately high impact on how democratization occurs currently in unrecognized states. So there are two research questions really to my dissertation. First of which is how and why do certain unrecognized states democratize despite expectations to the contrary? Very specifically, I have looked at Somaliland, the TRNC, and Taiwan as the three unrecognized states being considered in this dissertation. And then secondly, how does the democratization or de-democratization of unrecognized states affect conflict resolution efforts? Methodologically, I have adopted a post-positivist and structuralist approach because it fits my dynamical understanding of conceptualizing democratization, really. And I tried to be explanatory, building on exploratory work that already exists in the field. I have conceptualized the dissertation to be complex, multivariate, multi-level, and longitudinal. And I decided in order to really make it so, I had to make it in-depth and historical, whereby, based on the literature, a comparative historical analysis was the best methodology for this kind of undertaking. Data I have looked at, aside from the available literature, was official state documents, official documents from international organizations that are active in unrecognized states, reports from think tanks, CSOs, and NGOs active in unrecognized states, local newspaper reports or editorials, once again from unrecognized states mostly, and then published interviews with politicians and other prominent figures that were dealing with unrecognized states. And lastly, Freedom House scores, because this is the only democracy scoring index in the field that is actually considering unrecognized states in its matrix. So the variables I looked at, dependent variables, were democracy authoritarianism levels and the direction of movement along democracy authoritarianism axis, if you will, over time. Independent variables included siege mentality, CSO activity, government's repressive capacity, external actor interference, minority rights, crisis of legitimacy, empowerment of CSOs, type of economy, dependence on sponsor, and type of sponsor. The case selection, I eliminated anything that came before Cold War because post-Cold War timeframe has a different flavor to the understanding of democracy and democratization. I looked at positive cases especially and no parastates that were not fulfilling the complete functions of a state. And in order to increase reliability, I didn't look at landlocked or Caucasus-based unrecognized states because they would have very specific dynamics unto themselves. And I chose unrecognized states with different demographics and geographies and located in different geographies and with different economic policies in order to be able to really generalize from the few to many as much as possible. The limitations of the study, of course, is that it's a small N study. I only considered 3 cases, so it'll naturally have low generalizability, although, as I said, I try to increase reliability as much as I can by good case selection. The central state and democratization are disputed in the field, so it creates a kind of problem communicating among scholars. Of course, I believe that if my concepts are taken as a given, then the replication of this study should produce similar results. Democratization is a complex phenomenon, and while I tried to create as complex a picture of it and pursue as many factors as possible within a dissertation, of course, it'll be incomplete. I have not been able to consider all possible factors. And I don't think that would be an undertaking proper for a single study, unfortunately. And I haven't considered negative studies within this dissertation, but I am hoping that I will consider negative studies later on to see if the model produced through this dissertation would be applicable in different settings and would be able to explain why some negative cases have also occurred. So without further ado, we are moving on to my 3 cases, first of which is Somaliland. Somaliland had a long history, even before it became independent, of being ruled by clans. And after declaring its independence unilaterally, after the Somali Civil War, which was brutal, and through the victory and establishing their independence through the victory of the Somali National Movement, which is the SNM, who were war heroes, but they were a military organization belonging to the Isak clan. It created problems, this clanism and clanist divide, because when the SNM government, despite being war heroes, when they tried to centralize the power and economy and tried to overtake resources from clans, they ended up causing a civil war, which they lost, which became a systemic shock that increased democratization because it diversified power from just belonging to the Isak and the SNM to clans in general. The clans were strengthened, which was not good for democracy in the long term, as we will see. Now, after SNM, the elders of clans appointed Ibrahim Haji Egal, who centralized power with the support of his own clan, and after this embarked on civil strife for further centralization. And while the government and the clans tied during this time, the diaspora and sponsors, which included Ethiopia, actually supported the government because they believed that the government supporting the government would bring stability, which would allow for further development and trade. And this increased central power and increased security led to increased democratization. However, because the government was now in control of all resources and there was rampant nepotism based on clan lines, it led to high levels of corruption overall. And during the Egal era, authoritarianism started to take hold and people started being excluded based on their clans or based on whether they belonged to Egal's own personal network of patronage or not. So Egal's authoritarianism hit a crescendo with the establishment of Puntland, which was another unrecognized state established in the de jure lands of Somalia that claimed some of the lands likewise claimed by Somaliland. So it was a threat to Somaliland's sovereignty, if you will, de facto sovereignty. And the TNG was established, the Transitional National Government of Somalia, and it was supported by the international community as the de jure ruler of all of Somalia, including Somaliland, and this was a threat. So these two existential threats caused a high level of threat perception, and Egal started being much more repressive of critical dissent. However, the increased repression led to increased resistance, especially because the sponsors and the international community were actually supporting the resistance this time, because they believed that Egal was starting to be very authoritarian, like the case of Somalia before, and could lead to a brutal civil war. This begot that Egal had to compromise and enact democratic reforms that he had been delaying for 4 years, although he had promised a referendum on them. And eventually, this led to increased democracy. Especially tragic as it was, the death of Egal actually helped democratization in Somaliland because Egal had his own personal network of nepotism and benefit that fell down together with his death. So unfortunately, the democratization of Somaliland was not too extensive because Egal era left some legacies that were undemocratic, really, which was that elections and votes were postponed regularly, of which you can see a cartoon on the left. For example, Egal, his successor and his successor's successor all overstayed their tenure by 2 years. Thanks to the House of Elders, which is my second point, House of Elders are clan elders that have been given extreme power in Somalia as the upper house of the parliament, and they're not elected, they are just appointed, and they can perpetuate their terms for all their lives because they decide on this. This is very undemocratic, and it institutionalizes clan power, and traditional clan power is based on older males, so youth and women are especially excluded in Somaliland. And the Egal era also established a three-party political race for national elections, which meant that the three parties with the highest voting percentage, really, in local elections were the only ones who could dispute national elections. This was supposed to prevent division among clan lines so that not all clans had a candidate to dispute national elections. Unfortunately, it led to the fact that the three biggest clans, the three most powerful clans, are the only ones who get to dispute elections at this point in time. So that's also not quite democratic. Of course, Somaliland kept on suffering from what became adopted as its political culture, which is nepotism and clanism and corruption. It is expected that people in power will be nepotistic and corrupt. However, democratic reforms were well established by this time, and it was hard to roll back on them. So throughout the rest of the period of 2002 to 2010, Somaliland was stuck in a semi-democracy. Now, the next case study is Taiwan, which is an interesting Confucian democracy, defying Huntington's theory that the Confucian culture cannot democratize. China took over Taiwan from the Japanese colonial administration in 1943, and while the native Taiwanese were very happy to have their Chinese ethnic kin govern Taiwan, unfortunately, the mainlanders found the Taiwanese to be kind of different from them, more modern and less Chinese and more Japanese. And having been fighting communism in China, the mainlanders were very picky about this particular topic, so it caused a huge divide between the mainlander and the Taiwanese. And the Kuomintang, KMT, which was the single party of China at that time, ruled with an iron fist in Taiwan. And when they actually lost the civil war and relocated to Taiwan, the KMT, they enacted complete repression of any political dissent, including killing, and they excluded the Taiwanese from higher positions in government. Especially formative was the February 28 incident of 1947, of which a print you can see on the right. Unfortunately, there are no pictures that I could find, where the police actually killed a lot of Taiwanese dissenters, and they imprisoned them and tortured them during that time, which established that KMT was a perfectly authoritarian government, happy to repress and kill, and the Taiwanese dissidents had to go underground during this era. However, Taiwan had a very straightforward democratization process, especially as the USA started debating aid to Taiwan in 1975. USA was the main sponsor of Taiwan and its main security against China. And now it had started debating whether it should support a human rights issuing non-democratic regime. And Taiwan started losing recognition as China started gaining recognition during this time. And at this point, Kaohsiung incident occurred, where once again the government tried to repress a large rebellion, if you will, a large dissentive movement in the Kaohsiung Peninsula. But their opposition had become empowered by this time, and international scrutiny was high. So it failed to completely repress, and therefore there was a fallout, and there was even larger dissent as a result of the repressive acts. The first president of Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek, had died by this time, and his son, Chiang Ching-kuo, who took over, did not have the personal network that his father had, which meant that he was more open to really compromise on issues to perpetuate his power. And he started incorporating the Taiwanese into higher ranks in the KMT, including Lee Teng-hui, who became his second-hand man and then eventually the first elected president of Taiwan. Martial law, which had been enacted since the 1940s because of the fight with communism in China, was lifted in 1986, and this allowed for the first opposition political party, DPP, to be founded. Lifelong appointments in the Taiwanese legislature was abolished. Popular elections were first held in 1996, and the first peaceful transfer of power from KMT to the DPP occurred in 2000. which by most standards would beget that Taiwan had a well-established democracy by this time. So it was a very straightforward process in Taiwan. Now, this democracy was shaken but not stirred really due to some problems. Firstly, there's a polarization in Taiwan vis-a-vis how to deal with the issue of China, whether to cooperate with China, whether an eventual reintegration with China should occur. There is corruption and misuse of power at significant levels, but not so much more really than most other established democracies. KMT had a unilateral rapprochement with China, and KMT is still trying to really hold on to the ties with China, the mainland. And China is interfering sometimes for soft conquest through economy in internal Taiwanese affairs. So these are de-democratizing factors, but really Taiwan has remained a steadfast democracy over the period of time of the study. I want to go over what really brought down the changes in the KMT and allowed for democratization, which were two systemic shocks to KMT's legitimacy, which were the loss of recognition and the changes to the security paradigm on behalf of the West, where anti-communism was not enough anymore. Democratization became necessary. Systemic changes also occurred, facilitated by the fact that the Taiwanese had become well-versed in underground mobilization and resistance during the Japanese era, so they effectively carried the underground dissent out, and they had also become much more economically powerful during this time. So systemic changes were directly caused by the failure to repress in the Kaohsiung incident, the oppressed Taiwanese majority really having gained economic might and mobilizing well, and international scrutiny having been increased, the rulers being willing to compromise to perpetuate their power, and Taiwan having developed the necessary institutional capacity to carry out democracy. The last case study I'll be looking at is North Cyprus, which was born from a civil strife that was in Cyprus in 63 to 74, ended by a Turkish invasion or operation, depending on who you ask, really. And the TRNC was established 9 years after the operation, established in 1983. By this time, Denktash, the first president of TRNC, had established himself as the symbol of independence in Cyprus. And he put himself at the summit of power using his war hero image and creating and using a personal network. So from 1991 to 2000, North Cyprus was really ruled by corruption and patronage networks and dependence on Turkey, really. However, these de-democratizing factors were kept in check by the fact that Turkish Cypriots had a long history of self-governance and democratic governance, and democratic infrastructures had been inherited from the Republic of Cyprus, from which North Cyprus seceded. The first challenge to the legitimacy of the nationalist government that was claiming that the status quo was the best and independence was the aim was the crisis of 1996, an economic crisis that occurred, which showed that the government in the long term would not be able to really maintain a tenable economy in North Cyprus due to the isolations. Further systemic shocks came with successive economic shocks of 98, 2000, and 2002, and the EU negotiations for full membership having been started with the parent state. So while economy had declined, there was this carrot really of potential EU membership if the nationalist cause was foregone and North Cyprus reintegrated with Republic of Cyprus. And this caused also the system's repressive capacity to decline, because the government could no longer pay for co-opting opposition or really suppressing opposition. And Turkey was also aiming at EU membership, so the sponsor changed, perpetuating the status quo to really promoting reintegration and increased democracy, interestingly. So at this point in time, the Annan Plan came really at a ripe time as a target, if you will, for the opposition to unify and to rally against the regime. And it was a good moment for conflict resolution, and it also promoted democracy by emboldening and unifying the opposition. And therefore, democratization occurred due to social mobilization and international scrutiny coupled with the existing regime. Can everyone still see the screen? Okay. So this is a picture from the pro-peace, pro-democracy protests of that time. And I was involved during these protests as well. However, the democratization was short-lived because the increased democratization did not bring the increased prosperity that was expected, and the international community did not really engage further with North Cyprus. The nationalists therefore resurged through this disappointment with democratization, and they were able to reassume power, taking Cyprus back to the status quo ante, where nepotism and corruption were strong, and repression of critical media, education, and CSOs was there, and there was unilateral policymaking by the government. However, because there was the experience of democratic reforms, the status quo was not really anymore as authoritarian as before, but it never really became completely democratic. So without further ado, let's go into my findings. In this first table, you can see the external systemic shocks and their effect on democratization. And clearly, external systemic shocks have an effect on democratization, but this effect can be both positive or negative. In Taiwan and the TRNC, there was an increased democratization because the change in recognition and change in international memberships caused significant decline to the authoritarian status quo, resulting in democratization. In Cyprus, it was that there was the carrot of EU and recognition, which caused increased democratization because the nationalist claim to be the best option for the Cypriots was undermined. In Somaliland, meantime, the threat from Puntland and from TNG caused increased siege mentality, which caused increased authoritarianism. So clearly, external systemic shocks are significant for the democratization process of unrecognized states. On table 2, I look at internal systemic shocks, and clearly, local challenges are very important. So if there is no real local capacity to drive democratization, there might not be good results to internal systemic shocks, because Taiwan and TRNC, where there was local challenges, experienced increased democratization as compared to Somaliland, which did not. Now, economic crises also had a positive effect in North Cyprus because of undermining the authoritarian regime. In Somaliland, there were 2 civil wars, but they had mixed results, really, especially showing that who wins this civil strife is much more important than whether civil strife occurs in unrecognized states. And usually if the government wins, the status quo is strengthened. If opposition wins, there are changes that occur. On table 3, I look at regime environment, and really interestingly, threat from the parent state seems to have no real impact on democratization, which is kind of undermining Kasperson's hypothesis that siege mentality drives democratization. Earned sovereignty also seems to have a mixed result, and this also undermines Waller's approach. Having democratic neighbors does not really promote democratization either. However, economic isolation seems to be highly impactful on democratization because both Somaliland and TRNC experience constrained democratization due to economic isolation. And the stability of the status quo is also very important. The Taiwanese status quo of democracy was very strong, so no matter the threats or the shocks, democratization remained. And the same went for the TRNC's semi-democratic status quo, it kind of stayed the same. Whereas in Somaliland, there were changing degrees, and it really led to fluctuations. Looking at table 4, I looked at external actors, and clearly international aid is highly impactful because Taiwan and TRNC, which experienced higher levels of democratization, both had high levels of international aid as compared to Somaliland. Involvement of criminal organizations in public politics really does not have a huge effect on democratization, whereas external interventions, high levels especially, are significant, and so is the dependence on sponsor, but these are all based on who these actors are that are intervening. So the type of sponsor is very important, because if it's ethnic kin or clan-based, they are de-democratizing, but where it is ideological, it can be democratizing, especially if the sponsor is also likewise democratic. Lastly, I'm going to look at public politics, where we can clearly see that ethnic divisions in Taiwan did not translate into higher authoritarianism or ethnic warfare, really, because of high international scrutiny, showing that international scrutiny and international elections are very important in unrecognized states' democratization. In Somaliland, there was clan divisions and low international scrutiny, so clanism ran rampant, really. And in TRNC, there were ideological divisions with high international scrutiny, which meant that there was a kind of democratization that occurred, but this was constrained due to other reasons. So international scrutiny is clearly central. I did not include socio-political legacies, a table for them here, because socio-political legacies are very lightly related to unrecognized states' democratization. Likewise, economic activities are lightly related, belying the economy hypothesis. And categorical inequalities have a tenuous relationship with democratization in unrecognized states, which belies Casperson's hypothesis that the interactions between unity and plurality and the contention between those pulls and pushes defines democratization in unrecognized states. Now, I did find that trust networks, for which I don't have a table here, are highly effective in promoting de-democratization if they have a hold on power. However, this was already known in the literature, so I didn't consider that a very special finding for this particular dissertation. It was just a confirmation of what is already known. So the lessons learned, for me, the main lessons learned are that Casperson's model can help explain the dynamics immediately after post-conflict settings or at very high levels of siege mentality, but really fails to capture the complex dynamics of democratization in unrecognized states over the longer term. Kopeček et al. Built on her model to look at the longer term dynamics that can promote change with regards to repressive capacity declining and increased civil society activism, but they fail to account for when such changes might occur. Waller's model points us towards systemic shocks, which can explain when those changes may occur, but Waller fails to really cover for internal or economic shocks in his own model, or to talk about which shocks really, or under what conditions shocks would lead to systemic changes. Now, the type of economy also matters little, except for trade partners, which is lightly related whether trade partners are democratic. However, the type of sponsor matters significantly. As I said, an ethnic kin sponsor is really not good at promoting democratization because they have a stake in promoting nationalism and national unity. Systemic shocks are important, but equally or even more important is the degree of shock as compared to the ability of the system to accommodate this shock, to overcome this shock. So in 1996, in the case of North Cyprus, they were able to really absorb the shock of economic decline, and they were allowed to perpetuate the status quo, for example. An interesting tidbit from North Cyprus was that this politicization of CSOs, where CSOs become associated with certain political parties, is very detrimental to their work and to democratization, because CSO activism is important to democratization, whereas they lose the trust of the people and they start representing more the political agenda of the parties instead of the people. And this is a detriment to democratization over the longer term. And once again, sociopolitical histories and legacies can facilitate democratization, but they cannot explain the occurrence of democratization. based on these findings, I came up with an updated model where, as you can see at the top, there is a kind of stable system, authoritarian system, where there's a need for plurality, need for unity, vying for power. And there are systemic shocks which, if the government is able to suppress them, can lead to the perpetuation or reinforcement of the status quo, as compared to unsuccessful repression or failure to co-opt, or failure to overcome the systemic shock can lead to changes, which creates on the left a de-democratizing loop and on the right a democratizing loop, the relative strengths of which would decide whether democratization or de-democratization would occur in the unrecognized state at that time. So my conclusions are that unrecognized states can democratize and can fully democratize under certain conditions. This is a disputed point in the literature, so I would like to chip in on that debate. Their democratization processes are unique due to endemic sponsor dependence, level of international engagement and scrutiny, and levels of economic isolation, which are very important factors in unrecognized states. Most de-democratizing factors can be addressed by the international community, and if we are trying to solve conflicts involving unrecognized states, they really should be addressed, I think, by the international community as much as they can. And I also find that democratization indeed is a dynamical, complex phenomenon where socio-psychological factors such as siege mentality interact with structural factors such as a state's repressive capacity and international factors such as the idea of earned sovereignty to really bring up a very complex picture, which is why I think that all three hypotheses provided by the literature were quite valid, but not comprehensive enough to really capture the complex dynamics of unrecognized states. Implications from this are that democratization, I believe, is central to resolving the conflicts in unrecognized states. It would reduce the influence of shadow negotiators and plunder elite, or greedy elite who are perpetuating the status quo. It would limit the state's repressive capacity and strengthen CSO prowess. It can enable more representative and fruitful efforts at all the three tracks of international intervention. Longer-term peace and stability can be gotten through democratization, and if not resolution, at least cooperation with the parent state can be achieved through democratization. Now, engagement without recognition is necessary for the purposes of helping democratize unrecognized states. It would allow for legal cooperation with unrecognized states, which would undermine transnational criminal organizations and would make the governments more accountable. And it would help create positive trade with democratic partners, and it would increase international scrutiny and aid to empower CSOs. Now, I'm unfortunately not too optimistic about this because parent states emphasizing their own sovereignty would be probably against this particular policy approach, and territorial integrity is still seen as central in our current international conjecture, and that would also undermine support for this approach. I believe, therefore, that for further research, there's a need to conduct stakeholder analysis, especially with policymakers in parent states and international organizations, to see whether engagement without recognition can be effectively carried out. Following two slides are my bibliography. It is tiny because there's a lot, so in case you'd like me to go over them, please let me know, and I'd be very happy to do so. And I'd like to conclude with a huge thank you to my committee, Solon, Kevin, and Al. Thank you for all your help and support throughout this process. I really, really appreciate that. And I think that's the end, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Hilmi. That was a very thorough presentation, and I think covered the main arguments of the dissertation as well as some of the critical issues. So let's turn first, as I said, to Al for any questions that he might have, and begin the questioning in that way. Al?
Okay. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was very informative and comprehensive presentation you had. Thank you. I learned a lot. Okay. My first response is you really put democratization as, do you see it as the best alternative in terms of any form of government or governance at this very moment? Because from where I'm coming from as well, and Philippines, we are very close to Taiwan as well, you know. Democratization, and I've heard this very often from my colleagues and friends, is also often very much associated with capitalist, consumerist kind of society and system that I'm not sure if
Hello?
this is. Hello?
Sorry, I think I lost you there for a second.
Oh, okay.
I can
So-
hear you now.
Okay, so at first I felt like, you know, you consider democratization perhaps as the best alternative there is for now in terms of governance,
Yes.
you know. And then from where I'm coming from, I mean, in part of Southeast Asia, we're neighbors to Taiwan. Democratization is also often very much associated with the capitalist consumerist, you know, society and system. And I did not seem to hear that from you as a possible reason, perhaps, why it's not just a matter of autocratic or authoritarianism that is hindering an unrecognized state from becoming democratized, but in some cases, the populations, the people themselves, really are the ones kind of, you know, about promoting the democratization of their community or society precisely because of that fear.
Okay.
I mean, do you want me to just, you know, mention at this point my comments, so it'll just be a one-time kind of response? Because I have
However you'd like to go about it.
Sure, that's fine. Now go ahead.
Okay, so let me just go over this. You know, on your opening statements, you mentioned about negative studies, and I just would like to hear elaboration of that. And my other concern at this very moment, and later on I will just, you know, pitch in as well, is how do you move forward, you know, given your dissertation material? Where do you see yourself kind of, you know, taking the next step?
Yes.
That's pretty much it for now.
Okay. So shall I respond first?
Sure. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yes, please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for the feedback. The democracies association with capitalism really did not come up in my review. And since especially Taiwan is in Southeast Asia, I find that copious on my end, and I will...
Or Northeast Asia, yeah. Good.
I will assume that what I need to do is really look for this very specific dynamic of perception of democracy as capitalist overtake, if you will, and see what I can uncover in the literature on this topic. It did not really come up, unfortunately, in my literature review. So, as I said, I will go ahead and consider this, especially when I'm considering other cases as well of unrecognized states and their democratization.
Okay.
So I will really have to look for that. I think that's a very valid concern. Now, for negative studies, I'd like to find cases of unrecognized states that failed to democratize despite local movements for democratization and systemic shocks being experienced by the unrecognized states. So kind of look at why they failed to democratize and whether my current understanding and model of democratization of unrecognized states can help explain this failure to democratize on their end. So those would be some cases to uncover, and I would like to probably specifically look at Abkhazia as a potential case study for this one. And I think Nagorno-Karabakh is another one. So those two would be very specific cases. I did not include them in this particular study because they are in the Caucasus and they have very specific dynamics with proximity to Russia, and Russia being a very powerful sponsor. So for them, I will really need to consider that dynamic, and I will do that in future studies. Which I think goes to your next question, where I would like to take this next. So I would like to take the model I came up with and see if I can really utilize this model to understand the democratization or de-democratization of other unrecognized states in different times and different places, or if the dynamics have changed over time, that would be interesting to see as well. But I would also like to take the findings and go to stakeholders really and try to see what they would think of these, kind of prepare a policy brief, if you will, and go to stakeholders and see what they would think about these dynamics, whether they already knew these dynamics, whether this is new to them, and whether the idea that further engagement with unrecognized states and promoting democratization in them would be detrimental or beneficial to their own approaches to dealing with unrecognized states. So I would like to take that as my next step in this particular research.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Al, anything more that you wanted to ask or comment on?
Yeah, yes, I have one more actually here.
Okay.
Okay, help me, based on your studies and findings in these whole endeavors towards democratization of unrecognized states, where does the initiative usually start or come from? Is it always coming from the bottom up, or usually coming from top down, or a combination of this multi directional kind of approach?
Yeah, it seems like it usually is starting with a decline of the legitimacy of the existing authoritarian regime. So the systemic shocks are kind of necessary. And then you need a combination of both factors. So there needs to be some kind of international scrutiny and international engagement in that space, which would really empower the bottom-up actors, so the CSOs, the NGOs that are working in these unrecognized states, to be able to affect change. Because I really found that without international support, it is much, much harder for local NGOs and CSOs to make an impact. And this is the case in Somaliland, unfortunately, where the lowest level of democratization among these three was experienced in Somaliland. And one of the biggest factors is that the international community is really not engaged with them. And therefore, the local CSOs have nary an impact really on what happens politically in Somaliland. So there needs to be a kind of local willingness to democratize. And maybe that goes back to your point that if people are against democracy based on capitalism, maybe it's hard to democratize in those spaces. So there needs to be definitely local willingness and local efforts towards democratization. But it is not as effective usually if there is absolute isolation by the international community, because then an unrecognized state can really repress its own people. This happened, interestingly, in Cyprus, because when there was high international scrutiny, the government failed to repress. But then international scrutiny declined circa in between 2010 and 2015. And during this time, most protesters were actually beaten by the police, detained without reason for a very long time. Water tanks, water cannons. Water cannons were used against protesters, and pepper gas was used. But this is not reflected at all in the international community, and it created no outrage, really. and the local outrage was impotent against a government which would very much willingly repress its own people. So it seems like international scrutiny, international engagement is very central as well. But it needs to be kind of the auxiliary, if you will, rather than the main driving force, because without domestic will, there is not going to be democratization.
And sometimes too much intervention or involvement of the international community would also deprive, local initiatives and also people having that sense of ownership.
Actually, that's also
the democratization process.
That's an excellent point, and that's
start seeing it as an imposition of the international community upon them. And so, when it comes to sustainability of all these democratic ideals and aspirations, that could also be a casualty. I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Yeah.
Okay, I lost you for a second.
Oh.
No, I lost you for a second.
Oh, okay. I was saying that too much involvement and too much presence and intervention by the international community could also deprive, the local government of their initiative, and without having that sense of ownership of their own democratic ideals and aspirations, it might also be difficult for them to sustain. As it can be perceived as an imposition by the international community upon them.
Yes, and that was definitely a part of why the CSOs in North Cyprus actually got less legitimacy over time, because they were seen as colluding with the international community and especially the EU, from which they were earning getting a lot of aid. And so CSOs were seen as catering to what the EU wanted or what the UN wanted, rather than what the people wanted. And their activities declined over time, which is part of their politicization of CSOs point that I made. And thank you for bringing this up. This is a very important point indeed. Without ownership, democracy will not last much longer.
Great.
Thank you.
All right, great. Anything else, Al?
That's pretty much it.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for your questions and comments. Kevin.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I got the feeling Al was talking about the Philippines for a moment there. So let me say that I enjoyed the dissertation tremendously, and I learned a lot from it. And I think the structure of it, which you made very clear, and which you handled very, very well, is that on the one hand, you have a domain of inquiry, unrecognized states, which is not quite an empty set, but it's virtually an empty set with 4 or 5 main scholars and their theories in it. And you have mastered that, and I think your position to contribute really meaningfully to that literature is something that you've established and that you should now do, initially in a journal article or 2, and then further on. And then balanced against that, or badly balanced against that, is this huge and in some ways chaotic literature about democracy that I think you do a good job of trying to untangle, but it's one of those impacted forests with a lot of undergrowth. It's hard to untangle. And then, of course, your point is to try and connect this relatively small and open and comprehensible domain of unrecognized states to the kind of large, sprawling, in some ways inconclusive, or not entirely conclusive, domain of democratic theory and democratization. And I think you've done really a terrific job in trying to formulate hypotheses that will connect those two very unequally populated domains of knowledge. Let me say, I think this was a particularly effective précis or summary of the work that you just gave us in terms of the organization and the slides. And that when you now try to think about publication, whether in a series of focused articles, but really when you think about the book now, I really would suggest that you use the presentation that you've put together, the structure of it and the slides, as a kind of schematic or architectural drawing for it. Because if, as I said before, the dissertation has any weaknesses, they are mainly organizational weaknesses, questions about redundancy and so forth. And my suggestion is to use the very, very excellent précis and presentation that you've given us to form the kind of skeleton for next steps. So that's me editorializing. Let me go.
Thank you.
Of course, Hilmi. It was a pleasure to serve on the committee. I have a few specific questions. My first is about Taiwan. Early on, you referred to one of the criteria for choosing your cases is that you want a post-Cold War time frame. And I'm wondering whether your choice of Taiwan is a little bit vulnerable on that score, because after all, Taiwan comes out 47, 48, 49, the whole issue of in the West of who lost China. It's true that we usually think about the Cold War as being a kind of East-West, U.S., NATO, Soviet engagement. But I do wonder whether, as you review that criteria for Taiwan, you include some sort of justification for why you don't think Taiwan is one of the children of the Cold War, because I think there's some argument to be made that it is. So anyway, think about that, and you may want to respond to it, or just think about it in terms of reframing your criteria. You said that you didn't, when you looked at the factors, the independent variables for democratization, you said that you didn't consider kind of histories or legacies to be very important. You said they were facilitative, but not in some sense causal. So initially, I was thinking when I read the Somaliland case study, something that you didn't much talk about, although it's clear to me why you didn't consider it important, is that Somalia and Somaliland really did have different colonial histories. One was really part of a British colonial past, connected more to Kenya and so forth, and that was under Britain. And Somalia itself, especially with the era of Mussolini's expansion, but even before that, was connected with an Italian political culture. Some might argue that the British colonial history in Africa leads to one set of dynamics, and an Italian colonial history anywhere, including in Italy, leads to another set of dynamics. And you didn't consider it, and I just noted it. I didn't make a big deal of it, but I think some point can be raised when you talked about the Taiwanese case, not the Somaliland case, in that one of your important variables for the indigenous Taiwanese was that, having already undergone the occupation by Japan when Taiwan was Formosa, there was a kind of heritage of underground resistance and solidarity, sense of identity as Taiwanese against the kind of occupying power, and that and that was one of the factors that even in the face of the repression of 47, that helped the Taiwanese retain a sense of political agency, the ability to go underground, and so forth. So less about Somaliland, but more about Taiwan. Might you reconsider the impact of legacy, history, colonial occupation, heritage in terms of propensity for democratization? That's my second point. My third point, which actually you have talked about, and it's really a question about maybe can be said. Of the three cases, Taiwan and TRNC had powerful outside sponsors, both. And they were different in the sense that you could argue that in the case of Taiwan, the sponsorship of the USA was at least holding the KMT somewhat accountable for repression and authoritarian rule, whereas the sponsorship of Turkey of TRNC, while also powerful, didn't have that. I think didn't have that interest. So I wonder whether more can be said about the nature of sponsorships. And of course, in the case of Somaliland, there was really hardly a sponsor. I mean, there was Ethiopia, which was literally pursuing its own interests, and Somaliland was just a pawn. And then there was the interesting sponsorship of the Somaliland diaspora, which I think was kind of interesting because it was a non-state sponsorship. So there's not really much of a question there, except a suggestion that I think there's a lot more to be said about the differential kinds of sponsorships that these three cases had, and whether or not more can be teased out of it. My next point is something that you didn't raise here, but you raised it in the dissertation, and it was part of your discussion about for all of the ink spilled about democracy and democratization, there is still, in some ways, a great deal of disagreement and controversy in the field. And one of the things that you talk about are these indices, particularly the Freedom House Index, which later on you say you have real reservations about. So I wonder if you could, and this is not part of your formal presentation here, but I wonder in terms of connecting the cases to the more chaotic literature on democratization, whether you could say something about the weaknesses in the Freedom House type measures or metrics for democracy, particularly as you say they are one of the few, if only if the only metric that seems to include unrecognized states. So some observations and one or two questions.
Okay, thank you so much. Starting with the editorial, you raise really excellent questions that I will definitely need to answer, both right now and over the longer term. And I will start with question one, which was about Taiwan, whether it's a vulnerable choice. It is kind of vulnerable, more for me in the sense that most of the democratization processes or the underlying groundwork of democratization was done in Taiwan by 91. Really, it really occurred between the period of 79 to around 91. So by the time the dissertation's time period started, which is concerning 91 to 2010, there was actually a well-established route for smooth sailing for Taiwan. However, what I considered in this case as post-Cold War is that I considered cases that experienced a significant level of democratization according to Freedom House scores, which, as you said, I have scruples about that I will elaborate on in a second. But according to the Freedom House scores, that these three entities, so all Somaliland, TRNC, and Taiwan experienced some significant form of democratization during the era of 91 to 2010. So I considered that the post-Cold War era. And the reason I started looking at the post-Cold War era is that the approach to democratization and democracy and how central it has become to the international agenda, if you will, changed around 91. It wasn't quite as prominent from my reading of the literature until the Cold War had ended. And once Cold War had ended, that became the main agenda of the international community, it seems. So that's why I'm thinking Taiwan is somewhat vulnerable, because most of the interesting stuff occurred before the period of the study. But I'm hoping that it is not as vulnerable with regards to it having experienced democratization post-Cold War. Did that answer your question? Okay, I cannot hear you, I think.
No, okay. You said yes.
Yes, I did. You're fine on that.
Okay. Going on to the second question, in my point of sociopolitical legacy, I seem to have failed to make well in this case, is that they are really important in facilitating or undermining democratization, but they don't explain per se why democratization occurs. So even with the best sociopolitical legacies, Taiwan did not have democratization until other factors came into play, such that the sociopolitical legacy facilitated a smooth transition to democratization. So what I'm considering is that sociopolitical legacies are very, very important in facilitating the transition and might even allow for local ownership, as I was discussing with Al right before. If there are positive sociopolitical legacies as compared to, let's say, Italian sociopolitical legacies, as you have raised. So I would be happy to look at in further case studies how much sociopolitical legacies have affected other cases, and then potentially reconsider the place where sociopolitical legacies play a role. Within the dissertation itself, I think the evidence shows that they have facilitated democratization in both Taiwan and the TRNC, and in Somaliland constrained democratization, but they did not explain why or how democratization occurred. And that was the point I was trying to raise during the dissertation.
I'm going to move us along. The PT is going to move us from here, as it turns out. So,
yes.
Okay, so if I can push this along, it turns out the room is contested at 2:30, so I'll move us to the very quickly. I just have one broad question myself, yes. And then with the committee will retreat, we'll reconvene in another room.
Yes.
So there are, as I say, I think Kevin very eloquently summed up what it is that you're thinking about the dissertation and how to put it in a context and thinking about your next steps. In terms of the précis of the presentation being quite good, because I think it is your best telling of what you were up to. One of the things that you might want to consider, and I just very, very brief reaction to this, is in your slides and as you move forward, can you say a couple words about the methodology in terms of how you address non-spurious causation. You have very few cases, you have very many factors. How do you come to some sort of causal conclusions of the kind that you do? How do you parse these in a way which controls, if you will, for one factor and not another? I know you're doing it, you're making judgments. You can briefly talk about what we're doing here and then think about how to work that into the presentation, because that's a methodological issue that you'll want to work into your comparative historical method. Secondly, going back to the democratization issue, there's quite a lot about the causes of democracy, and I think this is something that Al picked up on as well. And then you have a story about the implications for peace. Most of those seem to just be your gut feeling. So if you could think about how it is, what it is that when we learn about democratization, what implications how does that relate to those implications you draw? Because in a way, the field will care as much about that as anything else. And then finally, with respect to Freedom House, in a way, if we go back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Freedom House scores represent the Anglo-British side of this conversation of civil and political rights, ignoring the economic and social rights and cultural, if you will, that were brought by the Soviet bloc and that was merged in that Universal Declaration. It seems that you might want to think about parsing some of those and breaking out economic and cultural rights in a certain respect. That might help to address some of Al's original concern about democracy and capitalism as well. That's more of a comment. So, but just very briefly, how did you deal with spurious causation?
So I tried to deal with it through a longitudinal case study. Mm-hmm. So I looked at how the variables interacted over time, again and again, of course, in different eras due to different external or internal factors, and whether their effect fluctuated over time or whether it seemed like there was a constant effect being shown when certain variables were in play, or when certain variables were not in play, if you will. So that is how I tried to really, based on a few cases, try to populate and answer how these very many factors actually interacted together.
So let me just give you a little piece of advice on how to frame that. You have a larger end study than you think, because in fact you've got many observations. They're clustered within a larger aggregate, which is the larger case itself. So think about it in those ways. It's more of a clustered sample, if you will, because you're actually doing that kind of work back and forth. So you have more observations than might imply. That's just something you should carry with you into your academic presentations, because that will be something that will be brought up.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate this point.
Wonderful. So I think that's anything else that we had. So Al, what we're going to do is we're going to reconvene. We're going on Skype.